my computer. I like the car I drive that has all the fancy stuff on it. I like if I get sick, I can go and get advanced surgery of various kinds and stuff to fix my problem. Technology has been a great blessing to mankind in many, many ways. And I'm not ready to go back to the Stone Age and live without it, quite frankly.
Right.
But here's the problem. As long as technology serves me, I won't get too upset. But when technology begins to demand that I serve it, I take exception.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's the deal with the civilization. You give up some individual freedoms for the benefits of the collective, but after a while, the civilization stops serving the people, and the people just serve the civilization, and then it's downhill.
Right. That's exactly right. So this is where, when we talk about technocracy, we're not talking about all scientists or all engineers. It's a subset of them. But those particular people have this attitude that they are the self-appointed saviors of the world, and that we have to do what they say, just because they say it.
Right, because they're smarter than we are.
Because they're smarter than we are. It's a very paternalistic attitude that they have. They really think that, we're stupid. And even just if we have a PhD, if that were possible, for all of us out here to have PhDs, that wouldn't really wash with them, because they feel like they're the enlightened ones. Like they see the world better and differently than the rest of us possibly could. And so, according to Al Gore, he wants to punish climate deniers. Well, I hate to say, there are at least 30,000 PhD scientists who take total exception to climate change doctrine.
Yeah.
And they're deniers, and they're PhDs. Well, see, that doesn't matter to Al Gore.
Of course not.
They're deniers just like the rest of you peons. They've slipped over the edge, and they've discarded their PhD or whatever, and they've got over to believe what the rest of you flat earthers believe.
This may seem a little sophomoric, but I've mentioned this a couple of times over the last week or two, that the old Man from U.N.C.L.E. series, the United Network Command for Law and Enforcement, their enemy was Thrush.
Yes.
Which stood for Technological Hierarchy for the Removal of Undesirables and the Subjugation of Humanity. And I thought, when we're talking here, I thought, okay,
yes,
these guys know about technocracy.
Yes, indeed, they did.
That's where they got that idea.
Let me invoke the name of Aldous Huxley.
Yes.
Who wrote Brave New World.
Oh, yeah.
I had to read that book in high school as a classic. It kind of scared me. I had to write a book report on it. And there were better books I read, but it was kind of a scary book, especially back when I was in high school. I mean, we didn't have all the technology. This book was a very far-reaching, into the future type of a book. But the book was written in 1932. That's Brave New World. Aldous Huxley. He's a Brit.
Yeah.
Where did he get his inspiration for that book?
I wonder.
This was never publicized anywhere. The only thing in sight in those days was technocracy. That's the only thing. And technocracy jumped the Atlantic Ocean. As soon as it got started here, it jumped the Atlantic Ocean straight into Nazi Germany. They started a parallel movement of technocracy in Europe.
Well, they took it and ran with it, didn't they?
They took it and ran with it big time. That might be another story. I don't want to get everybody all upset about Nazi Germany and stuff right now. There is a huge story there, but it's parallel, and there's lots of interesting things there. But I don't want to get too far into it.
Okay.
But I will say that Huxley was looking straight into the face of technocracy when he wrote Brave New World. And if you remember the theme of Brave New World, it was a scientific dictatorship.
Yes.
That's
exactly
what he got out of it.
Mm.
He looked at it and said, this is where this is going. And he saw it in 1932.
Yeah, and then Orwell comes along with 1984, and then there's the drug component.
Yes. And Orwell as well was inspired by technocracy.
Where does Robert Malthus fit into all of this?
Don't know.
Well, the guy who thought that human beings were absolutely too stupid to govern themselves, and that they would destroy themselves, and they're idiots, and they need to be controlled. Therefore, the Malthusian final solution.
Yeah.
That,
that's right. Yeah, we're too stupid to govern ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. Completely.
Yeah.
This is interesting. I was looking as your most singular speeches were being heard. I looked at some stuff, and in fact, I found one of the photographs. All these people lined up their gray suits and skirts and so forth, smart business suits for the women and so forth, and these names: Scott, Veblen, Hubbard, or maybe Hubert, and then this Howard Scott. It says attempts to link Thorstein Veblen with technocracy began almost immediately after the public discovery of Howard Scott and technocracy in 1932. In 1933, an article in Living Age by Leon Artzruni is a good example. The title was Veblen and Technocracy. Anyway, Howard Scott reported in a recorded talk to members in Detroit in 1951, William Randolph Hearst, one of the worst of all Americans. I have the original telegram signed in his handwriting, which was sent out to every Hearst official that the name technocracy was not to be used under any condition whatsoever. They were subject to dismissal and severance from the Hearst organization if they ever did so.
That's right.
This is just strange. And here it is. It's 2015. Individual air transportation is nowhere to be seen. In fact, in the United States, there's not even so much as a bullet train. But we seem to be the linchpin in global technocracy. So, anyway.
It's true. Yep. And Randolph Hearst, by the way, an eccentric guy that he was, very eccentric. Maybe not insane, but he was totally eccentric. He viewed his newspaper network as having been played by Howard Scott, and I think Howard Scott really did play him big time. Really? He learned how to pump the free press, to get articles written and stuff. And after Scott was discovered to be a fraud, not even having a degree, and after Columbia University booted him, Randolph Hearst got the idea there's major egg on his face if he didn't disassociate with Howard Scott and technocracy.
Pretty good thinking.
That's why he wrote that memo. But the unintended consequence of that also was why it got scrubbed from the history books. You see, history is dissected looking backwards.
Yeah. And
the way historians look at things, they go back 25 years and they see, well, what was being written about in those days, and then they go, oh, that must have been important because here's 15 articles in New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle or whatever, and they figure, well, okay, we're going to put that in the history book. We'll analyze it, put it in the history book. Well, when Randolph Hearst said no more articles on technocracy, guess what happened? There was just a vacuum, an overnight vacuum on technocracy. So when historians went back to see what was important in the day, technocracy didn't come up on the radar. Mm-hmm. There's no press.
Still existed, just not available for public viewing.
Yeah, they just ignored it, and they didn't put it out of the history books. I found a lot of information. I found a number of books that I was able to easily get that were written in the 30s and 40s. I found a huge archive of technocracy material up at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, of all places. And I went up there and spent a week at this library. They brought out cart after cart after cart of original documents and magazines and papers and letters, pictures. It was just a goldmine. And what had happened is all the leaders of technocracy up there in Canada, before they died in the 1990s, they all got together kind of for one last meeting, if you will, and they said, we need to pool our information and get a university to accept it, to keep it for posterity. And so they got University of Alberta to take it. And I don't think there probably been 10 people that ever looked at it from what they told me up there that ever cared. I was you're here for what? Well, I know you got it back there because I saw it on your catalog, And so they said, okay, well, we'll bring it out. And they gave me access to a copy machine, and here they just start pulling these boxes out, these library boxes. Man, I'm going through them left and right and making copies and, taking notes and everything. I found everything I probably could have written 5 books as a result, just what I found there.
Unbelievable.
But it was there. It was discoverable. It's just nobody ever bothered to do it. And yet the Hollywood Bowl was full of people learning about technocracy.
Extraordinary.
In the 1930s.
If you'd like to, pick it up. We were talking about the executive component.
Right.
A little bit earlier. If you want to just pick it up and go forward, I'm just going to sit back and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of hijacking the executive branch of our government was huge. They needed to get a hold of the mechanism to change trade policy throughout the world. And they did that through the World Bank presidents. They did it through the USTR. That's the US Trade Representative position. These are the people these are the engine drivers of the globalization process. It has been a trilateral globalization process. And I just have to say, don't let anybody try and convince you to the contrary, that there's some other policy group that's in charge of the globalization process in the last 40 years, because it simply isn't true. They're not looking high enough on the hierarchy, if you will, to see who's really at the top of it. We're seeing here who's at the top of it is these members of the Trilateral Commission. So when we look at the executive branch itself, since 1977, when Jimmy Carter got elected, both Carter and Mondale were members of the commission. Later, Brzezinski wrote that he had handpicked, and he bragged about it, he had handpicked Carter for presidency in the first place in 1973. He groomed him and trained him in all areas of foreign policy before he became president. So he was Brzezinski's guy. Brzezinski bragged about it. Nobody disputes that today if you do some research on it. But both Carter and Mondale were both members. Then along comes Ronald Reagan. George H.W. Bush comes in as vice president. That was never meant to be by the people. George Bush got bounced out of the primary in 79, completely bounced out, or in 80. And he got bounced out in Florida, by the way, because of a guy who stood up in the audience waving a copy of my book, Trilaterals over Washington. And it was the last straw for Bush, because he had been dogged during the campaign with people standing up waving my book. It's easy to spot. It's a red and white copy.
Unbelievable. That's excellent.
And they were asking him questions. Hey, are you a member of the Trilateral Commission? Are you, do you agree with this? And then they'd say something that the Trilateral Commission said. And people were livid. They understood it. And Bush finally melted in Florida, Dade County, melted down, turned red. You know, when people melt down, you can tell. He turned red, starts yelling, cursing. The string of 4-letter words came out of his mouth that would just make a drunken sailor embarrassed. And he ended up by basically walking off the stage.
And this was HW or W?
HW.
No kidding. He flipped out and started cussing at people?
You can't win the nomination without Florida. Everybody,
I think everybody knows that one, yeah.
And so he lost Florida as a result, and lost the primary to Ronald Reagan. And nobody figured he'd make a comeback at this point. But guess who, none other than Henry Kissinger, was operating within the GOP hierarchy. And Henry Kissinger came in. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission, by the way. And he came in, he says, George H.W. Bush is going to be your vice president if you want to survive. That's basically the proposition.
If you want to survive?
It wasn't a threat to kill him, but, if you want to survive politically, then you're going to take George H.W. Bush. And they had always intended that Bush would win the presidency in the first place. Reagan was not supposed to happen. But he did. And they couldn't just kick him out. So they said, look, you're taking Bush or else. And so he took Bush. The headline, by the way, after Bush melted down in Dade County, the headline the next day was, have you ever seen a burning bush?
Oh, man. Did this get much play? I don't remember this.
It didn't. That was the end of it. And then, the convention took place right after that. It was right before the convention. Bush thought he had it completely nailed at that point. He thought he was in. He really did. And his horrible performance at that last speech was this. I think that was his last speech that he gave. And the primary took place. Reagan took Florida as well. And then Bush got put back in as the candidate for VP after that. And then, of course, he became president. Well, bottom line is George H.W. Bush was a member of the Trilateral Commission. That's all there is.